All right, well, that was a lovely story, but unfortunately none of that was true. So I'm going to start with the reality of what capitalism actually means. According to the latest Oxfam Inequality report, 42 people now own as much wealth as the bottom 3.7 billion. And in Australia, the supposed lucky country, the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 70% combined. So the reality is we live in a society in vast abundance, but the vast majority of us are denied and excluded from that wealth. Currently, all of the productive resources of society are controlled by a tiny minority of people, capitalists, who use that control over the economy to maximise their profits relative to their competitors. This inequality is really tied to the fact that capitalism is a fundamentally class-divided system. And so for the vast majority of us, unless we're wealthy enough to opt out of the labour market, economic necessity compels us to work for a capitalist. So Jeff Bezos, for example, the CEO of Amazon, recently became the richest person in the world last year, worth just over $100 billion. Whereas Amazon workers, on the other hand, earn around $13 an hour, and 700,000 of them are so poor that they actually rely on food stamps from the US government. The US government subsidises these workers' wages, they're so poor. And under capitalism, it's not the case that we get to live our lives exactly as we wish. Actually, the reality is we are told how we can live our lives from the bosses. Bosses get to decide what time we get up in the morning, what we wear that day, when we're allowed to eat or go to the bathroom, what our facial expression has to be while we're at work, and whether at the end of the week we can afford to pay rent or buy food. So I think for the vast majority of us, it is simply not the case that under capitalism we can pursue our own desires. Bosses are also the ones who get to make the major decisions about society and how it's run. So, for example, whether investment is going to happen in, say, public housing or military funding, whether money is going to be spent on fossil fuels or on renewable energy. And this is not a democratic system at all. I also wanted to address the idea that people become capitalists by virtue of their intelligence or willingness to take risks or some kind of important work they do, because I think all of that is bullshit. The only role these people play in the productive process under capitalism is simply owning all of those resources. The reality is, actually, it's workers that produce everything of value in society, and our labour is the source of all profits earned by the capitalists. So just some facts for you guys. In 2016, the average hourly wage in the private sector in Australia was $34, but the average value of production per employee in the private sector was $61. So that means that every hour of every working day, the capitalists extract an average of $27 from each worker they employ. And the only capital bosses or CEOs ever risk is money that they've stolen from the working class. That's where all of their inheritance originally comes from. So I think we'll actually find that the definition of capitalism is a society that involves mass systemic theft from others. And you only have to look at what happens during strikes to see the truth in this. So when workers stop working, bosses go hysterical about how much money they're losing. Whereas if Gina Reinhardt took a holiday or just a really long sleep in one morning, iron ore would continue to be dug out of the ground and she would continue to earn $2 million every hour. So under capitalism, workers are free simply to choose which one of those capitalists will be the one to exploit us. So I think if the other side were actually standing for freedom, they would be for workers taking control of their workplaces, democratically, collectively running it themselves. Capitalism is a fundamentally unfree society. And that exploitation can only be maintained by extreme amounts of state force and coercion that's tied to that economic coercion. So I think we only have to look at what happens when workers do take effective strike action when they withdraw their labour to see the truth in this. The state declares that illegal. They say that workers are violating private property rights and that if they don't go home, they'll send in the police to break that strike up. Or we can look at the barbarism that refugees around the world are subjected to. While commodities are able to cross borders with total ease, the people that make them, their bodies, their lives are heavily regulated and controlled. If they cross those arbitrary lines on a map without permission, they face barbed wire, bullets, and the prospect of being locked up in torture camps for the rest of their lives. And all of that massive state violence and force is an integral part of modern capitalism. So what's the alternative? Well, I think the starting point for socialists is that there is no need for society to be organised this way. It's not efficient, it's not rational, and it does not meet human need. Socialism is based on the belief that in a world of vast wealth, poverty, homelessness, starvation and oppression can and should be relegated to the past. By socialism, we mean a world in which the productive resources of society are controlled by the vast majority of us, rather than a parasitical minority at the top of society. We mean a society in which workers democratically and collectively run their workplaces and establish mechanisms for asserting their control over society more broadly. And the idea that we can't collectively decide how best to do that, especially in the age of modern technology, is quite frankly absurd. So no, based on this definition, the USSR is not socialist, East Germany is not socialist, and Venezuela today is not socialist. Government intervention into the market or some degree of state ownership of industry doesn't change the fact that these countries, I would agree, like Australia and like the US, are oppressive, class-divided societies in which the vast majority of the population are exploited by a minority in power. So good we've got that out of the way. Now on to some of the other lies or untruths that the opposing side said about capitalism. Firstly, capitalism does not promote human advancement or innovation. It holds it back exponentially. So yes, unlike previous societies, say feudalism or societies based on slavery, for the first time in human history, we have a great abundance, and this is quite obvious if we look around the world today. But if your starting point for an economic and political system is how best to meet human need, then capitalism fails at every point. And that's not because resources are scarce, like in previous societies anymore. No, it's because the allocation of those resources are subordinated to the need of those capitalists to make profit. So globally, we produce 1.5 the amount of food required to feed everyone on the planet, yet approximately 9 million people die of hunger every year. Hundreds of millions more go hungry because they can't afford to buy it. There are over 1 million empty properties in this country alone, a figure that is only increasing, yet there are around 100,000 homeless people. And that's because under capitalism, food is not made to be eaten, houses aren't made to be lived in, they're made to be sold on the market, and they're only supplied insofar as people can afford to pay for them. So that's your wonderful price mechanism in action, that's your wonderful human flourishing. So, on to the development of technology. Well, I think it's just ridiculous that any kind of economic system produces technology. Actually, what makes everything is workers. So even under capitalism, everything is a product of collective human labour. Without billions of workers around the world assembling our technology, mining raw materials, transporting them across borders, nothing would be produced at all. Steve Jobs has never made an iPhone in his life. He relies on hyper-exploited workers in China. And so I think a genuinely socialist society could solve all of these horrors overnight. Starving people, for example, could easily be fed by using the world's vast transportation networks to get the 1.3 tonnes of food produced every year to those who need it. And there's no technological or logistical barrier to this. It's simply the way capitalism is run, only in the interest of profit. By dismantling the power of the capitalist class and removing that need, we wouldn't need to work so many hours. We could actually, develop as human beings in ways that are currently stifled by capitalism. For example, the 4 richest people in the world could guarantee that healthcare, clean water, and basic education to literally every human being on this planet. And so I think that kind of world is not only theoretically nicer, but actually possible. The fact that we do all of that work creates the basis to reorganise production to meet human lives and happiness. And with millions of people around the world increasingly seeing socialism as the answer to this vast inequality, I think the solution should be obvious.
Okay, so our third speaker is the campus coordinator of the Institute of Public Affairs, John Hajek.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry to say, but the Socialist Alternative's case so far wouldn't cut the mustard at a grade 4 debating workshop. We had no comparison that the motion demands, I know it was a sick burn, wasn't it, guys, between the two systems. They assumed as a premise exactly what they had to prove by saying capitalism is by definition a system of exploitation, instead of proving that that's what results from a system of private ownership of the means of production. And they gave no reasons as to why there is a direct link between, for example, capitalism and keeping out immigrants or refugees. There is no relation at all between those two things. You can easily be a capitalist and support the private ownership of the means of production and support letting refugees or immigrants into your countries. Moreover, we had no response to the poverty and global equality that Matthew talked about, which presents a bit of a problem for you guys. Because according to you, we have a world that is neoliberal and becoming more neoliberal by the minute. Meanwhile, 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. That seems pretty much incongruent with the doctrine that socialism always causes more, capitalism always causes more and more poverty. Moreover, and fatally for their case, they gave no alternative explanation as to how, in the absence of the price mechanism and the profit motive, which are key to being able to allocate resources and to know that you're actually producing something that's worth more than the sum of its parts, could be replaced under a socialist system. When the rubber hits the road after you've massacred the bourgeoisie, how do you decide how much rubber to use for car tires or pencil erasers or whatever without the price mechanism that does that effortlessly and automatically under the status quo? Always it ends up in you running out of toilet paper, without exception. So I want to talk firstly about profit. And I have a question. If corporate profits come from exploiting workers, then where do corporate losses come from? And I'd like an answer from the Socialist Alternative, because it seems to logically mean that those are cases of workers exploiting corporations. If you took 20 minutes out of your life to actually research this, you'd know that profits are not, in a free market, in the absence of government intervention, corporations exploiting workers. What they are the premium that a capitalist or a business owner gets from forwarding a worker the end product of his labour, so that he doesn't have to go through the lengthy and possibly dangerous and risky process of accumulating capital by himself. It is true, as he said, to some people they have no choice but to work for a capitalist. We say if that's the case, then don't leave them without a capitalist to provide them the only means of living that they have. If you don't have the means to start your own bakery, it's lucky that there are other people who own bakeries that you can work for right now. They tell us we live at the pleasure of bosses. They even tell us that it's because of these bosses tell us what time to get up in the morning. This is actually an important concession, and I actually kind of agree with you, because I agreed that under capitalism, under socialism, no one would ever show up for work on time. But if it's such a big deal, and if you think people are so desperate to get up at, 10:30 a.m., I've got a brilliant idea for you guys. Start your own business. Run from 10:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. and because that's so much more popular, you'll be flooded with workers who you can pay less than everyone else, and you'll make a killing. You should be really thankful for that helpful advice from me. So, immigrants and refugees. Again, it's very true that immigrants and refugees are much less of a problem for social societies, precisely because no one wants to immigrate to them and no refugee ever tries to get into them. It's true that East Germany didn't have to worry very hard about all the people trying to cross borders into East Germany, whether to process them onshore or offshore. What they did have to worry about was building a wall and shooting people in the back when they tried to flee the socialist utopia that they'd set up in East Germany. As I said in my introduction, there is nothing about supporting capitalism or supporting the private ownership and the means of production that means you also have to support keeping refugees or immigrants out of your countries. In fact, it makes it easier to absorb them, because under capitalism, they are more likely to become productive members of society who don't threaten to take from the people who already live in that society. Instead of under socialism, when they'd be guaranteed, generous welfare benefits and lots of benefits from womb to tomb, those people are perceived as much more of a burden on that society, and people are likely to be far less welcoming to those people. Next we hear all these people are starving and yet we produce so much food, 50% more than we actually need. I'd say it's a bit rich to talk about starvation coming from a socialist, but if so, by their own analysis, apparently capitalists are so rapacious and will do anything to make a quick buck, yet at the same time they're willing to let millions of piles of oranges and apples just sit in piles and rot. That is totally incongruous, and you've got to ask yourself why it is that we grow surplus food and then let it rot. Maybe it's because of things like government price floors or government subsidies, which encourage the artificial growing of too much food that we don't need. That's something to think about. I want to talk firstly in my sort of substantive material about inequality, and I want to address one big canard first. We heard from the first speaker that the top 42 people in the world, the richest, have more than the bottom 50%, whatever it is. I've done this debate about 4 times and had to correct the Socialist Alternative every time here. That measure is meaningless because it measures net worth. And if you have debt, even if you're quite affluent, like I am, for example, being a middle-class member of a capitalist society like Australia, you are still poorer than a rural Chinese farmer who owns nothing but like a few tools but has no debt. And so the richest 30% of the poorest 30% of the world are actually affluent people in Western societies who have more debt than who have a negative net worth because they have a lot of debt, like the Clintons when they left the White House, or Donald Trump at various points in his career. So you heard it here first. The Socialist Alternative supports taxing working people in order to give handouts to Donald Trump. We'd say, though, more importantly, real inequality has decreased because of capitalism. The average American today is richer than John D. Rockefeller was 100 years ago. They have technology that John D. Rockefeller couldn't have dreamed of. TVs, air conditioning, whatever, all because of capitalist progress. And the trajectory of capitalist progress is that what rich people have in their houses one generation, poor people can have in their cars the next generation, whether it be televisions, air conditioning, Wi-Fi, or whatever. Meanwhile, all socialists do is complain that capitalism can't provide in equal measure what socialism can provide to nobody. Moreover, we told you we're not fascinated particularly by Western societies. We told you global inequality has actually decreased because massive countries like China and India embraced market reforms in the 70s and 90s respectively, and since then hundreds of millions of people in those countries have been risen out of poverty. And if you really cared about equality, you'd probably give that some credit. We'd say socialism, moreover, and government failure creates a lot of inequality as well, like minimum wages and terrible systems of public education. Lastly, on the environment, many people will concede, sure, capitalism makes us richer, but it's a devastating cost of the environment. That's not true. I'll give you 3 reasons why it's better than socialism. Firstly, because the immense wealth that capitalism provides gives us the means to do things like spending on conservation, gives us the means to do things like drive Euro 5 compliant cars and do other things that care for the environment. How much do you think the average Soviet citizen really cared about the state of the forests and rivers when you spend 3 hours a day queuing for a loaf of bread and then go home to tear strips off the curtains to use as toilet paper? We'd also say, secondly, capitalism is more efficient than socialism. It uses fewer resources for the same amount of output. It took 4 times as many raw materials to make a car in the Soviet Union as it did to make an equivalent car in Japan. 4 times as many greenhouse gases, 4 times as much mining, 4 times as much deforestation. Socialist central planning wreaks havoc on the environment. Thirdly, private property gives you an incentive to actually look after the capital value of natural resources like land. Secondly, and lastly, capitalism forces us by the market mechanism to put our prejudices behind us because the only colour it cares about is green, and that means you're likely to be less racist and not care about irrelevant factors when employing and buying from people we're so proud to propose.